So good morning, everyone. My name is Silvia, and I'm the Public Engagement with Research Unit Operations Lead. And today I'm here for the first episode of the SOTSEF chat. And joining us today is Dr. Angharad Rudkin. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Angharad Rudkin the first question. And please tell us about yourself, tell us about what you do and what is your job here at the university.
Certainly, thank you, Sylvia, for having me here. So I'm a clinical psychologist and I work with children and adolescents clinically. So children who have anxiety or depression, or parents who would like some support in knowing how best to bring up their children or deal with certain family difficulties. And then I also, in the University of Southampton, I teach on the clinical psychology course. So I'm the child module coordinator. And I teach trainee clinical psychologists. So these are postgraduate students doing a doctoral course in clinical psychology. And then apart from those two jobs, I also do, I write. So I've co-authored a few books for parents and for children. And I do some consultation work. And I'm also a mother of 3 children, and I'm working from home, as everyone is at the moment, and enjoying the juggle that creates.
So you share some of the concern and some of the challenges actually that lots of parents at home had or are still having in these months. So I'm going to start with a few questions and then we see if anyone wants to contribute. But my first question is, now that phase lockdown is over, is it too early to start assessing the psychological impact of lockdown on children and teenagers?
I think in terms of generalised findings, it's too early. But, you know, speak to any parent out there on the street and you will hear the same kind of story, which is that some children have found it incredibly difficult, whereas some children have really enjoyed the lockdown experience. So it will be really interesting to see. There's big research projects. I mean, the University of Southampton is part of a lot of great big research projects right now to see what this kind of huge human experiment will lead to. Certainly some of the young people that I work with, those who are very anxious before about school and didn't want to go to school, were being bullied at school, or as they became teenagers were slightly concerned about how they look compared to peers and they didn't fit in. They initially in lockdown were hugely relieved of all of that because suddenly they could live in their bubble with, you know, no excuse. They could just be at home in their safe place and not have to throw themselves out into the sort of challenges of the wider world. So they were fine in lockdown. You have, on the other hand, children and teenagers who really, really rely on strong social connections to feel okay, who rely on good relationships with teachers, a very structured, organised day, being entertained and active pretty much every hour of the day. And those children found it incredibly difficult to be at home where suddenly there was no structure, no routine. They were kind of only there with parents and or siblings. So I think there's going to be a lot of different findings coming out. And I think when we look at how people have experienced lockdown, we're going to have to take into account their age, we're going to have to take into account gender, we're going to have to take into account personality, as well as family dynamics, because we are all in the same situation, but we are not experiencing it similarly at all. And, you know, you've probably, when you're chatting to friends or family, some will be really enjoying it, some will be not. And so we've all kind of had very different experience of it with different waves of feelings. So I think the important thing is when we're all coming out of lockdown is not to assume we've all had the same experience and not to assume that all children have had a terrible time or that all children have had a great time. We have to talk to each individual child. How's lockdown been for you? And certainly I know a lot of teachers that I've spoken to say they want to kind of re-engage with kids as they start coming back into school. They want to be able to talk about lockdown with them, and so they want to say, you know, bring in something that you can celebrate about lockdown. And we've had to talk to teachers and say, actually, for some children, there genuinely isn't going to be much that they can celebrate. You know, for some children, it really has been incredibly difficult, and they have been at home on their tablets for 10 hours a day because parents are working, or parents just genuinely don't know how to sort of engage with them at home. So we need to be thinking less about celebration, less about trying to put a positive spin on it, because for some children there genuinely was not a positive spin, but to say to them, how have you found lockdown, and what were the particularly difficult bits? What were things that weren't so difficult for you? And I think this will be particularly important when we think about going back into lockdown. There's a chance that we'll have another lockdown. It will never be as bad as it has been this time round for us all, because this time round, none of us had ever been in anything like this before. So it was so new and so unfamiliar and so uncertain. Whereas if we do end up going back into lockdown again, we'll be like, oh, yes, I remember what this is like. I remember the things that I did that helped me. I remember what I had to plan and organise to make the days okay. We're all going to be a lot more familiar with Zoom and House Party and all sorts of different ways of being able to communicate with one another socially and at work. Whereas at the beginning of lockdown, I mean, I don't know about you, but I had my kids didn't engage with their friends online at all because they're sort of 11 years and younger. So this was a whole new thing for all of us to try and figure out how to do, whereas next time everyone will be kind of a lot more used to it. So I think let's not worry about another lockdown, because we've learned a lot of lessons. So we'll go in a bit more prepared, a bit more ready, a bit more armed, and let's help children, each individual child, think about what it was like for them, what were the okay bits, what were the not so okay bits. And also as parents, I think that's really important for us to be able to reflect as well, that what was it like, because it's going to be a long time. We will have been in lockdown for a long time, and there are big waves of feelings and stuff that come and go during that time. So it's being able to really reflect on the times that were good, the times that were less good, and be able to use that reflection to help us move forward.
Thank you. That was very, very comprehensive. Thanks. So I have another question that kind of follow up your previous one. So are there any signs that parents, carers, or teachers should be aware to detect potential psychological changes in children and teenagers after this time?
Yes, I think there are. I think the biggest difficulty will be anxiety and motivation. I think that'll be the two biggies. So we know, for example, with anxiety, the reason we get anxious is that we overestimate threat and we underestimate our ability to cope with it. So there's two sides to anxiety. So when I'm working with children, we talk about an egg, that the top half is the threat and the bottom half is the ability to cope. So when we overestimate threat, when I'm working with young people with anxiety, and it's, teenagers, for example, they're going to think I'm stupid, they're going to think I'm ugly, this is what they say, this is their threat. And so they'd rather not go out with their friends than go out with their friends and have this kind of threat hanging over them. And we've got to really challenge that and say, well, how do you know people are going to think you're ugly or stupid, or that you're going to do something that embarrasses you? Whereas actually, when it comes to the pandemic, the threat is there. It's not an imagined threat. It's not like someone has overestimated the risk or overestimated the peril of it. It's in the news every day how dangerous this thing is. And even though individually for each one of us, we have to assess our own risks, I think it's going to be very difficult for us all to be able to say to a young person, oh, that you overestimated that threat. So with teachers and with parents, what we're going to have to be aware of is children are going to be more anxious in general about being well and staying well, and especially when colds and normal flu comes along, they might well be a lot more anxious about that. So we're going to have to be able to put that into perspective for them and be able to reason with them. When I work with teenagers in particular, we talk about the social muscle, so that being sociable is a skill. It's not something you have or don't have. It's not something that you're great at or you're not. Every single one of us has to work at being sociable. Even if we are quite extroverted and quite gregarious, we still have to work at being sociable. So we talk about the social muscle, and of course what teenagers and children haven't had exposure to over the last few months is being sociable. So they're likely to be a lot more anxious about it, a lot less confident about it. They're going to be overestimating the threat. Oh, my friends aren't going to want to play with me anymore. They're going to think I'm silly. We've got nothing in common. I don't know what to say to them. So all of these kinds of thoughts are going to be quite big. And so we just need to help them between now and getting back to school in September, build up their social muscle in a sort of safe way in terms of social distancing and, and following government guidelines, but in a way that helps them to very slowly but surely build up their sociability again. Usually this would involve very short little times together. So let's go for half an hour, meet up with one of your friends. It usually involves not a big group, but just a one friend or at the most two. And usually, especially for boys, but even for girls, having some activity. So saying to your child, let's go and meet your friend and we'll go for a little walk around the park and then we'll come back for dinner. So we can only be with them for half an hour. That is going to be a far more, well, they're going to be far less worried about doing that than if you said, we'll go out for the afternoon, or, we'll have your friend over for the whole afternoon, and you sort of leave them to it. So I would say as parents, to help your child build up the social muscle, make it very short times together, focus around some kind of activity, and just one-to-one or one-to-two at the moment, just because we're all a bit more anxious about being in groups than we are when we're just one-to-one. So I think that's very important. I think when we get back to school and having to do work, there are going to be some children who haven't done that much work for the last few months. And these are the children that I know a lot of people are very worried about in terms of professionals and academics and schools. These are the children who find it quite hard to motivate themselves to do work at the best of times. They rely on getting praise from teachers, having a look around the classroom, seeing all their peers doing the work, thinking, well, if they're doing it, I better do it. Having highly structured lessons, highly structured homework activities. Those children who've lost that and don't have as much internal motivation will be the ones who've woken up during lockdown and thought, oh, I've got that workbook to do, or I've got that video I could watch around history, but I can't be bothered. So they're the ones who, when they do get back to school, will just need to be retaught how to apply themselves to work, because they're going to not have picked up a pencil for a few months. They will have not actually had to work through a challenging maths problem. So it'll all be new skills. It's like relearning how to be at school. So some teachers, well, all teachers, but some children will have to have a little bit more input on that, I think. So I think anxiety and motivation will be the two biggies. Children and young people are incredibly adaptable. Most of them are quite resilient. We tend to worry more as adults than they do, but we just need to keep our eye out on those who are just struggling with a transition. For a lot of the people that I'm working with, I say, allow yourself 2 to 4 weeks of just feeling tired, worried, tearful when you start going back into school, because that transition phase will be the tricky phase. Once we're into the whole mode of being back at school or back at work, it will be fine, but there'll be this adjustment phase where it will just feel exhausting, and they will just want to curl back into their ball and not have to go to school, not be with friends, not have to do the work. And so as parents and teachers, we're going to have to be very gently encouraging of them and just set very small achievable tasks and just support them along the way.
Was incredibly interesting. In particular, I haven't reached with my family the teenager phase, so that is quite interesting actually to hear. I have another question that kind of was slightly introduced before and follow up. So we mentioned before the possibility of a second peak. So in case that a real second peak happens, what advice would you give to parents, carers and teachers to kind of self-prepare to discuss this and to help children and teenagers prepare for a second lockdown?
I think the temptation will be to try and avoid thinking about a second lockdown, because, you know, we've just vaguely now starting to come out with the first one. A lot of us can't bear the thought of it going back to how it was, but I think we need to be prepared for it. So opening up conversations with your child, you know, when they're starting to go back to school or they're starting to see their friends again, to really celebrate this with them. This is lovely, this is so good. But to be able to bring into conversations every now and again, and we'll know how to keep in touch with them if it happens again. And so I think it's just having it there as a possibility on the periphery. We don't need to sit them down and have a big conversation and say, look, there's a chance it's going to happen again, because that's just going to raise even more anxiety, because the more uncertain we are, the more anxious we are. So it's almost better off talking about it as something that's probably going to happen, but it's probably not going to be as long as this one. It will never be as bad as this one, as I say, because we've been there and done that already now. And so being able to think about what we can all do just to keep ourselves safe. So remember to keep washing your hands at school, even if, you know, it starts to feel as if it's all becoming normal there, and make sure you don't touch this, or so we can still remind them of things that they could do to keep themselves safe, even when it feels like life is returning to normal. But we also need to balance that up with really, as I say, celebrating normality and putting the school uniform back on, being able to go to the shop again. So it's about keeping a fine balance between now, the here and now, and having an eye to the future. So helping a child to really enjoy the here and now, but also letting them know this might not be a one-off, that actually it's going to be something that we might need to do a few times before the virus goes. If you've got younger children, you know, under fives, you can use metaphors and stories to help them understand this, you know, something about it's not just once that these things happen. You might have to sort it out again and again. I'm trying to think of something, you know, like in our family life, we've tried to get something fixed, you know, their bike fixed, you know, the bike is broken, so we go and get it fixed, and it comes back from the shop, yay, brilliant, it's working again. And then you take it for a ride and you realise, oh no, it's not, look, that bit's come off again. So you have to take it back to the shop to get it done again. So maybe helping children relate it to some part of their life where we often don't get everything sorted in the first time. We have to keep going back to it. Teenagers are very, they think in quite particular ways. So a very teenage way of thinking is all or nothing thinking, we call it, where something's either brilliant or awful, someone's either fantastic or terrible, you know, there's no middle ground. So there's a very good chance that their approach to the idea of another lockdown will be that it's absolutely awful, it's ruining my life, nothing's ever going to go well for me again. And we need to help them to see that actually it's really annoying and it's really frustrating, but there's still lots that you can do in life, and there's still loads that you'll still be able to get done. So helping them to see it won't all be bad. Even if as an adult you're sitting there thinking, oh, I can't bear to do this all over again. We just need to try and bring it into the middle ground, as I say, between the brilliant and terrible. That actually there'll be some good bits to it, there'll be some really annoying bits to it, but the reality is our day-to-day lives we're together, you know, the sun is shining, and just try and help them to really understand that sometimes we just have to be grateful for the basics.
Well, thank you. That was really great to hear, and really useful in particular. I haven't received other questions at the moment, but I had the last one for you. And this one is, what did you find the most challenges in the last 3 months on a professional level, but also on a personal level? You said that you're a mother, so I guess you will have quite lots of story in that, probably we might share. But what did you find the most challenging in the last 3 months?
That's a really good question. If I start on the personal level, I think my role as a mother, as a working mother, has been the biggest challenge, because the vast majority of my work is done when my children aren't here. So my children don't see me working, and that's how I've deliberately set it up. So I will work school hours, then I'll be with them after school, and then, you know, at the really busy times, once they're in bed, I'll come back to the computer and do my work again. So their perception of my work is quite different to their perception of my husband's work. He goes out to work and he has shifts. He's an air traffic controller, so he has to do his shifts and then he comes back. So his work's very visible in that way, that Daddy's not here, Daddy is. So what was really interesting when lockdown started was I had to carry on work. There was absolutely no let up with work. And my children, it took them a while to understand that I was working. So I'd sit in my little office here and I'd be staring at the screen all day. And then in between meetings, I'd open my door and there'd usually be one crying child at some point there. Oh. And I just found that juggle, you know, I just wanted to be with them and yet I wanted to get my work done. It was so difficult. It was, and it continues to be difficult, but I think we've got into a bit more of a routine of it. And I know certainly a lot of mums that I've spoken to, they have found it very difficult, and I'm sure dads have as well. But I think a lot of the mums, that sort of juggle of the mum working role has really taken its toll. Actually, I think it's been very exhausting. So personally, that's what I found challenging. I've had lots of wonderful times as well during lockdown. I've not missed dashing about, like, you know, after school to football and ballet. I've not missed that at all. So there have been some really good times, but that has been the challenge. Professionally, it is, what I found really interesting is the dialogue, the discourse that's been going around about mental health and lockdown. There are definitely, like I've said, there are definitely some people who have really, really struggled in lockdown, and life has not been good and they have not felt happy or well at all. But I think what we also have to talk about are the kind of natural resilience of people, that actually lockdown has been incredibly challenging, but for everyone on some level. It's been, they've learned something, they've achieved something, they've figured something out. So I think it's being supportive of the mental health needs of young people and children and parents now and coming out of lockdown, but it's also being able to say, you know, let's make sure we also capture what we've learned and what's been good about lockdown, about all that time together as a family, about learning about one another again, about negotiating different roles at home and what we've realised we can all bend to and be flexible about, really understanding our children and what they need. You know, there's so much of that I just think, I hope that is somewhere captured as well, amidst all of the talk about the challenges and the difficulties. And I think actually it's coming out of lockdown that people will need more support as we return to normal. We tend to be quite greedy as humans, you know, we want to be happy all the time, we want things to be good all the time, and if we're not happy all the time, we start worrying that something's wrong. And I think we're going to have to be very kind to ourselves and understand that actually this is going to be a tricky time. We can't suddenly expect to feel great and normal and fine, you know, that actually there'll be bumps along the road, and we just need to be kind to ourselves and to others. Compassion is very important at times like this. So I think it would be really interesting to see how the conversation changes as we come out of lockdown. And I really hope there's some brilliant research in London, which is purely based on what young people are telling us about lockdown, and we need a lot more of that, because otherwise the research is very adult directed as what we think children are going to be struggling with, and then we measure that as opposed to just chatting to young people and finding out what their experiences are. Yeah, so I think that's the personal challenges and the professional challenges.
It was absolutely great talking to you. You raised so many good points and good advice, and it was literally great. Thank you so much for joining us for the first episode of the SOTSEF chats. It was a pleasure to hear from you and talking to you. And well, until next time, we hope actually to have you back again to talk to us in public engagement with research unit. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a real pleasure to talk to you.